Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Thai Center and to our lecture tonight, examining the culture of Arabs and Westerners and looking at the main differences between them. Before we start, I should introduce myself. My name is Dr. Teresa Lesher, and I am a retired college professor. Part of my PhD studies was related to looking at the culture of Kuwait and seeing how that contrasted to the culture of North America, which is where I am from. So I should say, though, that most of the presentation tonight is more related to my own experience in Kuwait culture, because I have lived here in Kuwait for 40 years. And so I have been able to really experience the different cultures firsthand. So tonight's presentation will discuss the meaning and impact of culture, first of all, and then the second part will be the differences between North American and Arab cultures and how to reconcile those differences. The most important introductory slide I can show you today is this one, and it means basically that culture shapes people, and as well, people shape culture. So this is very important to keep in mind during our discussion tonight. Culture shapes our identities. Alaikum assalam. Every human being is culturally neutral at birth, and from that time, external forces gradually shape his or her cultural identity, both directly and indirectly. So here you see I have a picture of a child. We don't know where he's from. Let's say his parents might be of Far Eastern ethnicity. But no matter where we place this child, he's going to adopt the culture of his environment. So our culture is shaped, first of all, by our family, our school, our friends, and then also indirectly, it's shaped by our environment, by our language, and our media exposure. So on the topic of environment and language, if I would ask the Arabs in the audience to tell me what you see in this picture, what would you say? Snow. Anything else? Snow. Okay, if you ask a North American, he would probably say, I see snow, frost, ice, and hail. But most Arabs, having less experience with snow or ice or frost or hail, would just say, I see snow. Okay, now if I show you this picture and I ask the Westerners in the audience, what do you see? They would say, dates. Okay, now if I ask the Arabs in the audience, what do you see? What would you say?
Depends what you are looking for. You have 4 types of dates.
4 types of dates, okay. So the Arabs will start to classify dates by their stage of ripeness or perhaps the type of dates. So they would have many different words for the dates, exactly the way the North Americans would have different words for snow. Now, you know, these differences in how we see things or how we describe things is, of course, based on our language and our environment. And this is one of the aspects of culture. But what is culture? We can define it as the ways in which a group of people make meaning of their experiences through language, beliefs, social practices, and the use and creation of material objects. Okay, we're going to really delve into what this means, but the important word in this definition, I believe, is the word meaning. Culture is the production and circulation of meaning. Human beings are always searching for meaning. Whatever happens around them, they want to know, what does that mean? And we're different than animals, for example, who probably do not search for meaning in their existence. But definitely humans do. So shared culture leads to meaningful group experiences and shared identity. So we'll understand more about this as we go. Now, there are different components of culture. There's the surface culture, which is comprised of language, objects, traditions, and behaviors. And surface culture is very easy to learn, easy to imitate, and easy to adopt. For example, when I came to Kuwait, very quickly, I learned a few words of Arabic. I started using some of the objects that are common in the culture here. I adopted some of the traditions and behaviors. It was very easy to adopt the culture in that way. So it was easy to learn and imitate. However, there is a deep culture, and the deep culture may never be fully understood by a foreigner, and sometimes it may not even be fully understood by the native of that culture. And those deep cultural components include beliefs, values, assumptions, and thought processes. So we're going to look at some different components of culture now, and I'll give you some examples. For example, language. If a North American or an English speaker usually would describe a cousin as just one word, a cousin. But if you ask an Arab to describe the word cousin, he would say, well, which one? And he would have at least 8 and maybe infinite number of options. He would be the son of my father's sister or the son of my father's brother. Or are you talking about the son of my mother's sister or the son of my mother's brother? And they have different words for each of these, or different ways of describing. Or likewise, it could be the daughter of my father's sister or the daughter of my father's brother, and so on. So the Arab will describe cousin in 8 different ways, at least, while the North American would just say, he's my cousin. Benjamin Whorf in 1956 hypothesized that the categories and relations that we use to understand the world come from our particular language, so that speakers of different languages conceptualize the world in different ways. Now, we've already seen the example of snow and ice, etc., and dates. But language acquisition focuses our perception in certain ways, and it can affect the way that we see life. Now, a very good example for this part of the world is the use of the word Allah. Now, we hear people saying, Wallah, Inshallah, Alhamdulillah, MashaAllah. The word Allah comes up in conversation very often. And so people generally, if we compare them to, let's say, other English-speaking communities, people here generally seem to include God, the Creator, within their life, within their conversations much more frequently. And I think that God's presence, His effect, His people depending on Him, etc., is much higher here. And part of that reason is just because He is included in everyday language. And in every other sentence, you find God. Now, another component of surface culture is objects. How we perceive objects is influenced, how we perceive objects influences how the objects are defined in our culture. So, for example, we have 2 things here. We have an owl and we have a woman wearing a headscarf. If we look at the owl, and I would ask any Arab in the audience, what does an owl signify in your culture? What would you say?
Maybe religion.
Pardon?
Religion, maybe.
An owl would signify religion? The buma, yeah.
Maybe to some people it's a bad omen.
Yeah, it would be considered a bad omen or bad luck. Now, I learned this the hard way because when I was not too long in Kuwait, I wanted to give my father-in-law a gift. My father-in-law is a doctor, a consultant, he's an educator, and so I wanted to give him a gift, and I thought, perfect thing to give him is an owl, because in my culture, an owl is a symbol of wisdom. Maturity and wisdom, intelligence, and so on. And so I gave him a gift that had an owl theme to it. And I could tell when he first opened it that he didn't like it. I could see the expression on the face. And so I wondered, what did I do wrong? And I learned later on that the owl is a symbol of bad luck. It's like giving a black cat to somebody. So, okay, I learned I never gave an owl to anybody else since then. But if we think about it, does the owl have any inherent meaning in itself? No, it doesn't. We assign meanings, whether it's intelligence and wisdom or bad luck and bad omen. We are the ones who assign meaning. And also we can look at the woman's headscarf. In some cultures, the headscarf on a woman is a symbol of ignorance, oppression, and backwardness. But in other cultures, the headscarf is a symbol, along with other clothing, of freedom, of intelligence, of enlightenment, and of civilization. This small square of cloth has no inherent meaning, but the meaning that we assign to it is what is common in our culture. Another component of culture is traditions. The customs and traditions of one culture can be compared and contrasted to other cultures so that we can better understand the meaning behind them. Now, for someone who doesn't know anything about Thanksgiving, which is popularly celebrated in the United States and maybe North America in general, for somebody who doesn't know about Thanksgiving, I would tell him that it's like the evening of Ramadan, where we have a big feast, we invite friends and family, and we enjoy company, and we enjoy giving thanks for our blessings. For somebody who doesn't know about Thanksgiving, I would tell him that it's There's something wrong here. The evening of Ramadan, where we have a big feast, we invite friends and family, and okay, thank you. And then, of course, the opposite of true is true. If we have a Westerner, for example, who can't understand Ramadan and how Ramadan iftars work, we would say it's like having 30 days of Thanksgiving, where we invite people, we have a big feast, we enjoy giving thanks, and we enjoy each other's company. So this way, by comparing our traditions, we can understand each other's culture. You might want to check that. Something happened and there was like a playback. Yeah, on their phone. Okay. Another component of culture is social behaviors. Now here we have a very simple picture of somebody giving a gift and somebody receiving a gift. However, the meaning of social behaviors differ from culture to culture. If you want to give a gift to somebody, first you should consider the occasion. Is this the proper occasion to give a gift? Is this an occasion where I should give a gift, or it's not really necessary? The second thing is presentation. I have my gift. Now, should I wrap it? Should I put a bow on it? Should I put it in a bag? Should I only put it in a bag without wrapping it? How should I present it to the person? Okay, then we come to giving the gift. Should I give it to him with my right hand or with my left hand? Or actually, some cultures you should give with both hands. Or should I just walk in the door and sort of put it on the side and not pay too much attention to it? That's also a valid way to give a gift in some cultures. When you're receiving the gift, should you take the gift and unwrap it in front of everybody and thank the person? Or should you kind of just peek in the bag very discreetly? Or should you just put it aside and ignore it as if you don't care about it? All three ways are valid in different cultures. And then, of course, we have the follow-up. Should I reciprocate with a similar gift? Should I call them and thank them? Is it enough to send a text message on WhatsApp? How should I handle the follow-up? So all of these questions that are involved in giving gifts, of course, are different from culture to culture. And this is part of the culture that we understand, each one of us from our own point of view. So here we have the surface culture, which is, we discussed, language, objects, traditions, and social behaviors. But there are also the deep culture, and that's values, beliefs, assumptions, and thought processes. And cultural scholars believe that Arabs and North Americans are cultural opposites. Now, this statement definitely was true 20 years ago when a lot of research was being conducted on Arab culture, especially in contrast to North American culture. However, during the past 20 years, I think because of social media and, the prevalence of the internet in our lives and just media in general, I think that the differences are becoming less. Because different cultures around the world are being diluted, and we're becoming more the same than we are different. However, I do think that it's important to look at these differences because it can help us to find cultural balance and comfort in different cultures. So now we're going to look at some deep culture, and the first one is values. People usually value what their families, community, and culture value. And here I have a list of several different values: family relations, hard work and achievement, personal happiness and self-actualization, material wealth, social relations, spiritual development, status, and knowledge. Now, if I asked each one of you to prioritize these values according to your perspective, everybody would have a slightly different list. Some people would value family, and some people would value work, and everybody would have a different number one. So the question then becomes, are your values universal? If you value family, do you think that everybody in the world values family first? Or if you value knowledge first, does everybody in the world value knowledge first? Of course, the answer is no. So then the more important question is, should these values be universal? Do you think everybody should have the same priorities when it comes to values? A very good question to think about. Values are also relative and subjective. So, for example, we have this woman on the left. She says, my friend is tall and light-skinned. And we have the lady on the right, and she says, my friend is short and dark-skinned. Do you think they are talking about the same person? It seems unlikely, but in fact they are talking about the same person, because to her, her friend is tall and light-skinned, but to the other, she's short and dark-skinned. So you see, values are relative, and they're also very subjective. It's according to our own measurements that we are giving values. Another component of deep culture is beliefs. Beliefs are almost always absorbed from the family and community. They are deep-seated, they may never be questioned, and they are very difficult to change. Even if you want to change your beliefs, it takes time. Now, I'll give you some examples. Try to keep them neutral, non-offensive. Good communicators are subtle or explicit. Some cultures will say good communicators are subtle, and others will say they are explicit. Another one, attention to details or the big picture is most important. Okay, according to culture and also on an individual basis, the answer will be different. Assertiveness is a sign of strong character or weak character. From culture to culture, the answers will be different, but generally they would be the same amongst people in their own culture. So when we don't understand the deep culture, the values, assumptions, and thought processes, then we get off balance. We get our cultural balance disturbed. And cultural balance is knowing consciously and subconsciously what things mean and how things work in a particular community. When we have cultural balance, we have a sense of stability, confidence, independence, security, and belonging. And when we lose our balance and we slip into culture shock, we often go into a state of confusion or anger or depression. So understanding the deep culture is very important in maintaining our cultural balance. So remember this slide, because people shape culture and culture shapes people. It's a very fluid thing that changes with time and across geographic regions. And so now I would like to go to the second half of this presentation, which is about the differences between North American and Arab culture. And scholars have traditionally asserted that they are cultural opposites. So I will be comparing and contrasting these cultures. And I do have to warn you that I'm going to be using some broad generalizations, which means stereotypes. And I want to remind you that these generalizations do not apply to all people, that this is just a convenient way to contrast the cultures so we can better understand them. But of course, there are differences, there are variations for many different factors. But for comparison's sake, I think it's a very useful conversation. So one of them, the Arabs or the Americans, is a literate society, and the other one is an oral society. Which one do you think is literate, Arabs or Americans? Well, usually the North American culture will be considered the literate society, and the Arabs would be considered more an oral society. Now, how does this play out? A North American if he has free time, he would probably prefer to read. And if I asked all the North Americans in the audience who is reading a book at the moment, I think every single one of them would raise their hand. The North American is also used to looking up information. If he needs information, he will look it up, he will Google it, he will go to the library, he will refer to his reference books, and he will resort last to asking somebody. He wants to go to the source. A North American, if he goes to a developing country, okay, let's say he comes to the Arab world, parts of it are developing, he would have a complaint that he can't find the information he needs. It would be more difficult for him because the traditional sources of information are not always in place. Now, the Arab, on the other hand, he prefers to talk in his free time. So if he has a few minutes, he might give his friend a call, or he might strike a conversation with somebody next to him. And when he needs information, he probably wouldn't waste his time looking for it. He might just ask somebody, just call a friend, call the office, ask your neighbor. He would find a way to ask information for help. And his complaint when he goes to the West is that I need information, but nobody is willing to help me. They just tell me, why don't you just look it up? So the differences between the literate and oral culture are many, but these are just a few examples. Now, I'll give you one example. I have two pictures here of women shopping. A Western woman, when she's shopping, she will just look at the price tag, she will go to the cashier, and she'll pay the amount. But an Arab woman, and I've caught myself doing this many times, I will look at the price tag, I will go to the cashier, I will show the cashier the price, and then I will ask her, how much is this item? And then she will tell me. And it might seem silly, but I know that based on my own experience, that sometimes the price isn't what's actually written, or sometimes I might be entitled to a discount just because I'm a very special customer, which I seem to be a very special customer wherever I go, and I'm sure everybody is. But the point is that even during shopping, it's always nice to hear the information from somebody's mouth, because then you're sure that that's the bottom line. So sometimes there's a little negotiating or discussion about the price. And so that's why sometimes we don't follow the price tag, but we ask. Okay, let's go to another example. Arabs either emphasize relationships or emphasize action. Which one do you think Arabs emphasize? Yes, usually relationships. The North American, for example, when it's the weekend and he's thinking how to plan his weekend, he will probably focus on doing something. Okay, what are we going to do? Where are we going to go? And then he will have an activity in his mind. But on the other hand, the Arab, on his weekend, he will probably be focused on who. Who am I going to visit? Who do I need to see? Or who is going to go with me when I go and do the things I need to do? The North American, another example, in a job interview, would probably focus on his accomplishments. He would talk about all the things he did. He would talk about his education, his experience, and so on. However, an Arab in a job interview, he might focus some on his accomplishments and merits, but he probably will also focus on his connections. He might say, my brother works in this organization, or I used to work in another organization with somebody important. It would be significant to mention if he has any social connections related to this job. And along the same lines, if a North American organization is hiring somebody, they would probably put out ads and to attract the best candidates. But an Arab company might put out word of mouth. They might tell their social circles that we are looking for a candidate to do such and such a job. And they might start looking sort of informally first in their social circles. The North American will trust colleagues after performance, once they have, consistent high performance, then they would be trusted. But on the other hand, Arabs might trust somebody after socializing with them. So they want to be able to sit with them, get to know them, know their character, and then after socializing with some time, they would begin to trust them. Okay, going on to the next one. Which one is more family-oriented rather than friend-oriented? Westerners, North Americans, or Arabs? Arabs are more family-oriented generally. Of course, again, I want to stress that these are stereotypes. These are broad generalizations. It doesn't apply to everyone. North Americans generally, because they can be friends with their colleagues and they might meet up with them after work or school. And friends often meet in family homes. So if you have a friend from work or school, you would tell them to come over and visit me in my home. Now, in the Arab world, friendship may be limited to place. Like your friends at work or your friends at school, but oftentimes you wouldn't be friends outside of that context. For example, you wouldn't invite your colleague to your house, or you wouldn't invite your classmate to your house. So sometimes it's limited to place. And also, I think that family homes, especially in the Gulf area, are private and that friends usually meet in public spaces. So it would be more rare to invite a friend to the family home. And in all cases, I believe that among Arabs, family has priority. And I didn't want to write that that among North Americans, friends have priority. I don't think I would say that, but I think friends have a higher priority maybe than an Arab would place on friends. Okay, now we're getting a little bit more abstract here. Arabs would function image or function value? Let me say that again. Arabs would value image, or do you think that Arabs would value function over image? This is maybe a little bit harder.
Image. Image.
Yes, I would agree. Yes, that Arabs would value image over function. Okay, now here we have clothing. If we just look at the clothing of these two gentlemen, the gentleman on the left, he looks like he's going for an outing. He's wearing very casual clothing, comfortable. He's wearing layers. In case it gets too hot, he can take a layer off. He has his backpack with everything essential. He has pockets and a lot of pockets in his pants to put all his important things. He has a hat to keep the sun off his head. And of course, he's carrying his bottle of water, which he must keep. Now, the gentleman on the right, of course, he's wearing something that's not very functional, not very practical to wear, but it's beautiful. It has a very beautiful image. So I think, like I said, the lines are becoming more blurry and the culture is becoming diluted. We find many Arab men that are dressed as, in more comfortable and functional clothing. But generally speaking, we can say that Arabs tend to go more for image rather than function. Another example is pens in your pocket. Now, if we had, at least in my father's generation, every man would have a pen in his pocket, in his breast pocket. And we don't have very many Western men in the audience tonight, but I'm sure if we did, and I asked how many of the Western men have a pen in their pocket, many of them would raise their hand. Now, the Arabs might also have a pen in the pocket, but unfortunately, that pen doesn't always work. And I found that out one time from my Kuwaiti boss, who he asked me to come to his office and sign a paper. And I said, I don't have a pen. I left my bag in my desk. And I said, can I just use your pen that's in your pocket? And he said, no, that doesn't work. It just looks good. So I realized that, a lot of the pens in the Arabs' dish dashes don't work. Maybe they dried up a long time ago, but they sure do look nice in the pocket. So that's another example of function and image. On the ladies' side, I shouldn't say just the ladies, but generally the ladies, the North American woman would probably be more conservative in her hosting. Now, I'll explain. I'm a North American woman, and usually if I'm going to have guests to my house and I'm making dinner, I would count the number of expected guests, and then I would figure out how many pounds of meat I need, how many potatoes, and so on and so on. And I would kind of calculate what I need because I don't want to overcook. Of course, I would cook more than I need, but I wouldn't cook too much more than I need. On the other hand, my Arab sisters-in-law, if they're having people over for dinner, they would cook a lot of food, much, much more than needed. They would have several different dishes and large amounts of all of these dishes. Their hosting is very extravagant. And it's not that they're showing off, but they just want to offer the best and the most of what they have. So again, in hosting, it's more about image than function. A North American hostess would probably be much more conservative. And now for the teachers out there, if you are a teacher that has ever required school reports, then you have probably noticed sometimes a difference between the Native American students and the Native Arab students. The American students usually don't spend too much time decorating their reports. They spend time on the research, or at least when I was in school, we did. We spend our time on the research, and we know that the paper should be very plain. The Arab student, on the other hand, will spend probably a significant amount of time decorating the research paper, making a nice cover, maybe adding stickers throughout, maybe coloring borders or adding illustrations or something. But they're much more decorative because they feel that it should sort of have a colorful image. So if you're a teacher, you might ask your students about that. It's very interesting to see the difference between North American and Americans and Arab students. Going on to the next one. Arabs have either a linear thought process or a non-linear thought process. Which one do you think Arabs would have?
Probably non-linear.
Non-linear, exactly. Now, what does that mean? We'll have a few examples here. In a linear culture, people would speak in turns. So if you have a big group of people, then one person would speak and everybody's quiet while that person is speaking, and then somebody else will speak and then they'll take turns. But in Arab culture, it's common to have simultaneous conversations in the same room. So if I have a group of 20 people, I might have actually 5 or 6 conversations going on in the same time. Even at a meeting, you're having a committee meeting, you might have many people talking at the same time. And they know how to handle it. Now, writing research or giving presentations or writing even stories or whatever, the linear thinker would think in terms of an outline. And you can see the illustration here on the left. He would think in terms of ABC, 1, 2, 3. These are very important concepts that we learn in kindergarten in North America. When we write our papers, it would have an introduction, a main body, which should be at least 3 points or 3 paragraphs, and then a conclusion. We would state our point, and then we would support it with details. Now, the Arab, on the other hand, would probably not have such a linear structure. He might not have instructions to have a clear order to his thoughts, and his outline would look more like mind mapping. So you see the illustration on the right where we have a mind map. So maybe the Arab's thinking process would look more like that. He might give a lot of related information. Maybe it doesn't even appear to be related to the listeners, and they might feel confused, they might feel lost, they might not be sure where he's going with this. And sometimes the speaker or the writer, maybe he won't even tell you what the point is. Now, that's not because he doesn't know what the point is, but because he wants just to present the information to the listener or the reader, and he wants to give you the opportunity to come up with your own conclusions. Now, you might think, if you're a North American person, that takes a long time to get used to. And you would say that this is like not a very good way to communicate. But on the other hand, an Arab might look at our very structured, very tight way of presenting information and say, you didn't give me any wiggle room. You didn't give any room for interpretation. So it just depends how you look at it and what you're used to. Now, if I were to, in linear and nonlinear thinking, if I were to ask somebody of linear thinking mode to draw a bowl of fruit, he would draw a bowl that looks like the one on the left. But if I ask somebody who's used to nonlinear thinking to draw a bowl of fruit, he might draw the one that looks like the one on the right. So it's just to show you the difference between linear and nonlinear, and to be aware of it when you come across it, that it's not wrong, it's just different. Another way we see nonlinear and linear is in lining up or in queuing. Of course, you can recognize the picture on the right, people queuing one person behind the other. There's another kind of queuing, like on the left. It's called the mob queue, and this is where people just mob around the front desk or wherever, and they kind of like jostle for attention and to be served. Now, it's not happening so much in Kuwait anymore. 30 years ago in Kuwait, yes, we would see a lot of mob queues, and they're not queues, they're just mobs of people that are trying to get service. Nowadays, things are, more, let's say, organized, and they're more linear, and queuing is very common. But there are some places in Kuwait where queues do not exist. And the best example I can give is if you go to these little tiny shops where they sell sambusik and sandwiches, like the 100 filled sandwiches, those shops don't have lines. It's just a mob. You go in there and there's no line, and so you're really not sure where to stand. But the one who's serving the people, he has in his mind a line of who's first and who's next. Who goes to the front of the line, even if he's standing in the back? It's the elderly person, the woman, and the influential man. They would be invited to come to the closer to the beginning of the line. And the younger people, the less influential people, they are invited to wait just a little bit longer. And you might say, well, that's not fair. But those people, those young people, those less influential, one day they will be older, and then they will be invited to the beginning of the line. So it's not that it's wrong, it's just that it's different. Time is another way. Time is another way that culture differs between Arabs and North Americans. And of course, you can guess that North Americans prefer linear time. When they have a project to do, the steps are usually sequential. And I just remembered that, I recently visited my son, and we had a small project to do, and I was very bossy, and I said, no, first we have to do this, and then we're going to do that, and we can't do 3 until we do 2, and I had the whole thing organized in my mind. So the project was one thing at a time, and I didn't feel that we should even start number 2 until we finished number 1. The other thing about linear time is that people don't like interruptions. They like to work on a deadline. They like to know, when is this project due? They like to have a schedule. They like to be on time. They like everything to be organized and managed. Now, for North Americans, they're probably thinking, of course, that's how you get things done. But some cultures, and Arabs included, prefer flexible time. Projects are fluid, and tasks can change. People who are working on a project would respond to opportunities and challenges, so they might stop one thing and start something else and then go back to the first thing. They can multitask. They don't mind interruptions as much. They're more adaptable and more flexible, and we can say that they tend to go with the flow more than their North American counterparts. So it's a different way of handling projects, and each one would say about the other, that is a very inefficient, difficult, stressful, and time-consuming way to handle a project. And I find it really fascinating that the Arabs would say that about the North Americans, and the North Americans would say that about the Arabs, that this way does not seem to make sense to them. So if we go on to another component of culture, it's communication. And North Americans would value indirect communication or direct. What do you think? North Americans. Direct. They would usually prefer direct communication. Now, in direct communication, you have direct requests. You just simply ask the question, can I do such and such? Can I have such and such? You use active listening, which is repeating what the other person said to make sure you understood. And you would maybe summarize, for example, at the end of a phone conversation with a colleague, I would say, okay, so you wanted me to do 1, 2, and 3, and I have to get that done by this day. And then after that, we're going to discuss something else, right? And he would say, right. So that would be like repetition, active listening, and summary. In indirect communication, the listener is very sensitive to indirect requests, subtle suggestions, and hints. Okay, so he would be trying to understand what the person might be saying but not saying. He would trying to be reading between the lines. He would trying to be watching his body language and his tone of voice and other cues and clues to help him understand what he really wants to say but maybe feels he can't say. So this is the person who is involved in indirect communication. In direct communication, differences of opinions are usually shared openly. Okay, for example, a teacher might be teaching a class in university, and if one of the students doesn't agree, the student can just raise his or her hand and say, I don't agree with that, and give his point of view, and there's nothing wrong. But in an Arab setting, for example, maybe it would not be valued for a student to disagree with the teacher, or a younger person to disagree with an elder. Sometimes direct communication can be seen as disrespectful and domineering. And sometimes indirect communication can be seen as secretive and ineffective. So it's very important to find out what kind of cultural preferences your listeners have, and then try to cope with that as best you can. I have a little picture of some prayer beads there on the right-hand side. And I'll just give a little example. If you have a friend and he happens to be holding these prayer beads in his hands, and you admire them and you say, oh, those are really nice beads, very pretty. Where did you get it from? He might think that it's an indirect request to take those beads, and he might give it to you. Of course, he might just think that he wants to give you a gift and he'd give it to you. But in some cases, he might consider it as an indirect request. So what I'm saying is that the Arab is very sensitive to that. Maybe the North American wouldn't think of that by admiring an item that somebody happens to be holding, that it's an indirect request. So sometimes you have to be a bit careful. You have to be aware of the cultural preferences of the people you're dealing with. Okay, now we go to another kind of cultural difference related to communication. In North American culture, what do you think? Is the speaker responsible for communication, or is the listener responsible for clear communication? In North America, the speaker would be responsible. Okay, this is similar to what we were saying before. Speakers in North America are expected to convey information as literally and explicitly as possible in simple, clear language, avoiding ambiguities and contradictions. However, speakers in the Arab world expect the listener to correctly interpret the implicit messages, to read between the lines and analyze the ambiguities and contradictions. So the Arabs' communication is more complex and more nuanced, and the North Americans' communication is more direct and more clear. In North America, as I said, good communication is precise, simple, and clear. And in the Arab world, it's nuanced, layered, and very sophisticated. In social situations, Americans ask questions to get information from others. So when I meet a North American, they say, oh, when did you move to Kuwait? How many kids do you have? And they ask a lot of questions. They want to know about me. The Arabs, on the other hand, are a little bit more hesitant to ask such questions, and they might tell you about themselves. It's like, I work in this place, and I have 5 children, and I have some grandchildren, and they're giving you information about themselves. At the same time, they're waiting for you to give information about yourself. So in North America, we would ask a question, but in the Arabs generally tend to wait for you to offer information because they don't want to pry. And also in North America, it's more common to say, oh, I read that about something. I read something in a magazine. I saw something on television, et cetera, et cetera. But in the Arab world, stories are very common. And actually, stories are essential in conversation. They will talk about their lives, about things that happened today or that happened in the past. And all of this is ways of communicating. Now, I'll give you a little example about the responsibility of communication. I have a picture of a lady with luggage. Okay, this is my sister, okay? My sister, for example, said, I'm going to come and visit you. And she would say to me, this is how my sister thinks. She would say, I'm going to come visit you in November 2022. Okay, we're talking 11 months from now. She would plan way, way, way ahead. I'm going to come visit you in November 2022, and I'm going to arrive on the 1st, and I'm going to leave on the 8th. And she would send me all the details, and I would say, great, and I would mark it on my calendar and be expecting her. Now, on the other hand, my sister-in-law, an Arab woman, would tell me, I'm going to come and visit you next week. And maybe she wouldn't even ask me if I'm free, but she would say, I'm coming next Friday. And I would be excited and happy, and I would, welcome her and everything. She would arrive on Friday, and we would spend Friday together, and we would spend Saturday together, and we would spend Sunday together. And then I would start getting nervous because I really don't know how long she's going to stay. She didn't tell me. All she said is, I'm coming on Friday. So I would have to devise a plan in my head to find out how long she's going to stay. And I can't ask her, how long are you going to stay? And I can't say, when are you going to leave? Because that would be rude. So I have to devise a plan. And so I would say, oh, there's a concert, next Wednesday. Would you like to go? And, then from this conversation, I could find out if she's going to be here or not going to be here. And then I could find out when she's planning to leave. Now, the thing is, the responsibility of communication in the West, like my sister, is on her. But from the Arab world, the responsibility is on the listener. I have to find a way to find out the information that I need. Okay, now we're getting toward the end, and it's getting a little bit more abstract. North Americans are actually, I'll put up the next one. North Americans usually have what is called a low context culture. And Arabs, on the other hand, have a high context culture. So let me explain what that means. North Americans generally listen to words to extract meaning. Okay, if there's let's say 2 friends or 2 people who met, first time, let's say, they would listen to the words to extract meaning from each other. But in a high context culture, people, of course, they listen to the words, but they also focus on nonverbal cues to extract meaning. And usually I like to give this example because a lot of times, we're not aware of that. And so if we have North Americans who are visiting Kuwait or visiting the Arab world, and they're not aware that this is a very high context culture, they can find themselves in very difficult situations. For example, if you have a pretty woman who is in the mall, and let's say an Arab man would go and talk to her, and, because he wants to be her friend or whatever, and he might talk to her, and she's not interested, and, she just wants to move on. But because she's used to smiling at everybody, she might smile. She might, look at the person in the eye and, just tell him, I'm not interested or something. But the Arab, on the other hand, if he's in a high context culture, he might be listening to her words, he might be seeing her smile, he might be catching the eye contact, and he might be confused. And what does she actually want? Because the words are contradicting the the nonverbal cues. For her, there's no contradiction because she is focusing on the words and that's all that matters to her, But, so this is just a little example of how if you're not aware of the high context, low context situation, it can cause some uncomfortable situations. Context, you see, is loaded with meaning. And now this will apply for everybody. If you are, let's say you're taking a walk in the park. Now we're on the right. It's daylight. And you see this man running toward you. You're walking in the park. It's the middle of the day. And you see that man running toward you. How would you feel? Anybody? And the guy on the right. It's like, so what, right? No problem. He's just jogging. Okay, but now let's imagine that it's dark and you're walking in the park and you see a man running at you. How would you feel? I mean, just saying it right now, I got goosebumps. Yeah, I got scared just for a second. Now, it's the same thing. You're the same person. He's the same person. It's the same exact thing. The only difference is the time of day. So you see, context is very important. Context makes a big difference. So we have to be aware of the context of nonverbal cues, of facial expressions, tone of voice, and so many other little factors that can affect conversation. Arabs are more in tune to that than North Americans. I have another example. That's why the little teacup popped up there. Another example. I'll sit down for this one. You're visiting your friend, and you've had a nice evening together, and it's like 9:30 at night after you've spent like 2 hours just talking and enjoying each other's company, and then you look at your watch and say, it's 9:30, I really should go. You have work tomorrow, I have work tomorrow. Maybe it's time for me to go. And your hostess says, please don't go. I've enjoyed your company so much. And let's get some pizza. We haven't had dinner. I'd really like to talk to you more than this. We've just gotten started, and I'd like to continue this evening. It's been so pleasant. So the question is, then what would you do? Would you go or stay? Okay, Karima says she would go. She's an Arab. And I'm sure if somebody else, Janet, what would you do? Go or stay?
Maybe stay.
Okay, Janet is North American. She would stay. Now, why is there a difference? The difference is that Janet, as a North American, is listening to the words. And the friend said, you should stay. We're having a good time. I still want to order pizza. But Karima is an Arab, and she's more in tune to maybe body language, to other gestures that might contradict the words. And so, Karima, did you pick up on it? What happened? Why did you say you should go?
Because I know that this kind of welcoming out of her generosity, but in the real situation, I should be more polite and consider her situation.
Yeah, okay, she would consider the situation, and she feels that it would be more polite just to go. But actually, I gave a very good cue, a very good clue to the whole situation, is that as a hostess, I stood up. And that is a clue that, yes, now it's time for you to stand up and it's time to go. Now, if I stood there, I'm the hostess, and I said to my friend, and I put my hand on her wrist, and I said, no, please stay. And, and I just stayed sitting. That would be more convincing to the guests that, yes, I should stay. But if I stand up and say, oh, please don't go, and I'm like walking to the door, please don't go, that's a clue that, yes, it is time to go. But if I hold her wrist and say, let's order pizza, and I pick up my phone, she's serious. There's no contradiction there at all. It's like, the high context cultures are like an old married couple who have been married for 30 or 40 or 50 or more years, that they're very in tune to each other's needs and expectations and moods and so on. So sometimes it's just the wife's posture or facial expression. It's just the husband's tone of voice that would make the other spouse aware of what that person wants. Yes, Janet?
I believe something that I didn't know. When the hostess liked liqueur, that's a sign that everybody should be.
That's right. Yes. That's a very good example, actually, that in Kuwaiti and Gulf culture, Bukhur is can be used as, a signal that the evening has come to an end. So it's the last delight that the hostess is going to offer to the people, and then after the bkhur is spread around, after the incense has spread around the room, then it would be time for people to go home. So rather than saying, hello everybody, it's time to go, you just pass around the incense and everybody has a good feeling and a good mood, and then they know that it's time to go. So yes, thank you, Janet, for adding that. So high context cultures usually have large families and lasting social networks. They have a long shared history. They pass knowledge from generation to generation. They have less mobility and less foreign influence. So low context cultures, on the other hand, are very fluid, a lot of foreign influence. Families maybe are not as close and not as large. Here's another example of high context and low context. If I ask a Westerner, a North American, to describe the weather in Kuwait, he would probably say, well, there's spring and there's summer, and there's nothing else. But if we ask a Kuwaiti, especially the old generation of Kuwaitis, to describe the weather, he would probably give you 10 or more seasons. And these seasons are based on different things, not only temperature. They're based on wind patterns, on humidity, on the presence of dust, and of course, temperature. So there is actually the schedule of seasons in Kuwait, and it's amazing that it's very accurate. The other thing is I have a compass there in the left corner. A lot of Arabs are very aware of the cardinal directions. You can put them outside, you can spin them around and then say, okay, which direction are you facing, north, south, east, or west? And they can tell you because they're used to, for example, they're used to watching the movement of the sun so they can pray, at the right time for the prayer or the right direction of Mecca. So generally, I would say they're more aware of their environment more than North Americans. Of course, again, I have to say, these are stereotypes. It doesn't apply to everyone. I'm sure there are many people who are aware of north, south, east, and west, even if you spun them around in their environments in North America. Okay, we're getting near the end here. North Americans generally, let's say the majority of North Americans generally value left brain functions. And here we can see a list of left brain functions. It's micromanaging. It's more verbal, more rational. They stress accomplishments and experimentation. They like control and logic, and they like to do things right. Now, on the other hand, let's say the majority of Arabs, if we follow the cultural patterns, would value right brain functions more. And that's more of a macro or a big picture. They're more visual, spiritual. They like community experiences. They're more interested in fulfillment and experience. They like cooperation and diplomacy, and they like to do the right thing. There's a difference between doing things right and doing the right thing. Now, I'll give you a little example. Here I have a little picture of an elephant. Now, this is a true story. My friend, who is, she's from London, and her husband is Canadian. They lived in Kuwait. They've moved away, but they lived in Kuwait for several years. And one day they took their children to the zoo. While they were at the zoo, something happened. I don't know. She never told me exactly what happened, but there was a problem with one of the zookeepers. And so my friend said, well, we really need to go to the management and tell the management what happened. So they go to the manager's office, they knock on his door, he welcomes them inside, they explain the problem that happened with one of the zookeepers. And what does he do? He says, sit down, please, please. You're welcome. Please sit down. And he orders cake and he orders tea and he gives the whole family their refreshments and they have a nice long conversation. They chatted for about 20 minutes. And the man never really talked about the problem. And then in the end, he said, are you okay now? Are you happy now? And they said, yes, we've had such a lovely time. It's been so nice to chat with you. And thank you for all your stories. And then they left and they were wondering, what happened? What happened? Now, I think what happened, when she told me this story, that was just it. But I think what happened is that this zoo manager felt that everybody is entitled to a good experience when he came to the zoo. obviously, they did not have a good experience because there was some problem with one of the zookeepers, and they actually came to his office to complain. So he took it upon himself to make sure that this family had a good time. So he ordered tea and cake and conversation and stories and laughing, and they went home. Now, if he was a North American manager, he would probably say, "Thank you very much for telling me about this problem. I will take care of it." And then he would leave the office and he would go to the zookeeper and he would solve the problem. Now, there you have the difference between doing things right and doing the right thing. The North American would be very concerned about getting things done right, addressing the zookeeper, and the Arab one would want to do the right thing by showing the visitors a good time. So it's just a difference in perception. Who knows, maybe the manager did go to the zookeeper and address the problem, but he still had to make sure that the visitors were happy. So this is like a very good example of the difference between left brain and right brain functions and how we place value on them. And then I finally have one last example. Now, let's say that you are a businessman. Let's say you're a Western businessman, and you're ready to make a deal with an Arab, and you go to his office and you sit down with your computer. You have all the statistics, you have all the spreadsheets, you have all the information, you're ready to sign the contract, you're ready to go. And you sit down and he comes in with nothing, not a single paper, nothing. He orders tea and he starts talking about his trip to China, and he starts talking about, his university days, and he asks a few questions about, where have you been? Where do you like to travel? Just general questions back and forth. And then 20 minutes pass, and you're wondering, when are we ever going to sign the deal? When are we ever going to talk about it? We haven't even started, and I really want to go to the next meeting. So what do you think is happening in this situation? What's going on? The North American, of course, is very confused, very frustrated, maybe even angry. He's wasting my time. But it could be that the Arab is getting to know him. It's not just about the deal for him. It's not just about the numbers, the contract. He wants to know, is this the kind of person I want to work with? He wants to kind of size him up in a way, to know about his values, about his experiences, to get to know him as a man before he gets to know him as a number or a contract or a business deal. So you see, this can be very frustrating. But if you know what's happening, you can just relax and enjoy the conversation, enjoy the company, get to know your partner, and probably the business deal is going to go through, but you have to be patient. There's another very good example of the difference between right brain function, left brain function, between high context and low context. So you see all of these things come together, and it makes a huge difference in relations between North Americans and Arabs. Now, most people, when they encounter people from other cultures, react in one of three ways. A very common way is with ethnocentrism. And that's when you say, my culture is better than your culture. In fact, my culture is the best. It is the model that you should be aspiring to, and it is the goal that you should be trying to reach. Okay, now we can see Arabs saying that, and we can see North Americans saying that. Another perspective, a cultural perspective, is romanticism. And that's when we have an incomplete view of the culture. We might pick up on some aspects that are charming and cute and fun and tasty, but we might be missing the big picture. We might miss the total meaning and way of life. We misunderstand it or overlook it or are not aware of it. So this is a partial understanding, and we tend to romanticize that portion. The third way, and of course the best way, is the comparative perspective. And that's when we study other cultures, and that study of other cultures leads us to a deepened self-knowledge. We become more aware of our own values, and we can then reconsider those values and maybe adjust those values according to the, our communication and experiences with others. And of course, we can better appreciate other people when we look at them, very openly, without the, partial view, and definitely without the ethnocentrism. So how can we develop this comparative perspective? It means that our enduring patterns of perceiving, relating to, and thinking about ourselves and others must change or expand. Okay, we have to expand our way of dealing with others, talking to others, and thinking about others. We will grow when we accept that the social practices, beliefs, values, assumptions, and thought processes of others may be as viable as our own. And this is so important because we come across people and we say, wow, they're so different from me. And you know, they're wrong and I'm right. But if you can think that it works for them and my culture probably doesn't work for them, if we can be open and if we can explore the beliefs, values, assumptions, and thought processes of others, and we realize and admit that it's just as good as ours, we will grow as humans and we will be able to cooperate on a much better level. So in other words, what we're really aiming for in our intercultural relations is to say that we're okay and you're okay too. That we're both good, our cultures are both good. They're different, but they're both good. And we can understand where they're coming from. So this is the end of my presentation. Before I open to questions and comments, I just wanted to announce that next week I'll be giving another presentation related to this. It's about third culture kids growing up among cultures. And a third culture kid is somebody who has lived in a culture different than his parents' culture, or perhaps he has two parents from two different cultures. So the third culture kid is the one who takes parts of each culture, and he's a different mix than either his mother or his father. So I've also left my email address here. If anybody would like a copy of this presentation, just send me an email, ask me for it. I'll click reply and attach the presentation so you can review it again or perhaps share it with your friends.